Chalchiuhtlicue, she of the Jade Skirt. A tale of water, life, and renewal. In the time before time. Before our world existed, before the sun rose in the sky you see today, before the mountains lifted their ancient heads toward the heavens, there was darkness. But this was not an empty darkness, not a void of nothingness. It was a darkness pregnant with possibility, heavy with potential, thick with the dreams of gods who had not yet dreamed their greatest dreams. This was the time of beginnings, the time when all things waited to be born. In this primordial darkness dwelt the supreme dual deity, Ommediatl, both male and female, both creation and destruction, both beginning and ending contained within a single divine essence. Ommediatl existed beyond the understanding of mortal minds, a being of such perfect balance and completeness that from this unity came forth all things. From Ommediatl's divine essence emerged four sons, four great powers who would shape the cosmos and all within it. These were the Tezcatlipoca, though each bore different names and wielded different powers. There was the red Tezcatlipoca, known also as Xipe-Totec, the flayed one, god of spring and renewal, of the shedding of old skins to reveal new life beneath. There was the blue Tezcatlipoca, called Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of war and the sun, fierce and bright and necessary. There was the white Tezcatlipoca, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, god of wind and wisdom, of learning and life, gentle yet powerful beyond measure. And there was the black Tezcatlipoca, who kept his father's name, the smoking mirror, god of the night sky, of destiny and sorcery, of both creation and destruction intertwined. These four divine brothers stood in the darkness and contemplated what they might create. They had formed the earth itself, a great disk floating in infinite waters, and they had set the heavens above it like a great dome. But the earth was barren, empty, waiting to be filled with wonders. The gods began their work of creation, and as they worked, they learned that creating a world that could sustain itself, that could flourish and grow, required more than just earth and sky. It required water, precious, life-giving water. And so the four great gods, working together for the first time in perfect harmony, created two divine beings who would govern all the waters of creation. They wove together threads of starlight and moonbeam, mixed them with the essence of clouds and the memory of rain, shaped them with the power of storms and the gentleness of morning dew. From this divine crafting came forth Tlaloc and Chalchiuhtlicue, the Lord of Rain and she of the Jade Skirt, husband and wife, brother and sister, two halves of a greater whole, together responsible for all water that would ever flow across the face of the earth. Tlaloc was given dominion over the waters that fell from the sky, the rain that nourished crops, the storms that announced the changing seasons, the lightning that split the heavens with its brilliant fire. His domain was the clouds and the sky, the high places where mist gathered and rain was born. He was a powerful god, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, always necessary for the survival of all living things. But Chalchiuhtlicue, her domain was different, and perhaps even more essential. She was given dominion over all the waters that gathered upon the earth itself. The rivers that ran from the mountains to the sea, carving their patient paths through stone and soil across countless ages. The lakes that lay like jewels in valleys and hollows, their surfaces reflecting the sky like mirrors. The springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth, cold and pure and sweet. The streams that chattered and sang as they danced over stones. All of these were hers, all of these answered to her divine will. Her name, Chalchiuhtlicue, carried profound meaning in the Nahuatl tongue spoken by those who would come to worship her. Chalchiuhtl meant jade, that most precious of stones, more valued than gold, greener than emeralds, symbolic of all that was beautiful and important and sacred. Huitl meant skirt. Together, her name painted a picture, she of the Jade Skirt, she whose garments flowed like water, whose very being embodied the precious, life-giving essence of the sacred liquid that sustained all existence. In the divine realm where the gods dwelt, Chalchiuhtlicue was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension. Her skin seemed to glow with an inner luminescence, as if lit from within by captured sunlight filtering through clear water. Her eyes were the deep blue-green of lake water in summer, reflecting the sky while hiding unknown depths beneath their surface. When she moved, it was with the fluid grace of water itself, sometimes gentle as a quiet stream, sometimes powerful as a waterfall, always captivating, always mesmerizing in its perfect natural flow. Her hair was dark as obsidian, falling in long waves past her shoulders, adorned with small shells and smooth river stones that clicked softly together when she walked. Around her neck hung a necklace of jadeite beads, each one perfectly round and smooth, glowing with that characteristic green that spoke of life and growth and fertility. But it was her skirt that truly defined her, that marked her as unique among all the gods. It was fashioned from fabric that seemed to be woven from water itself, blue and green and turquoise, shimmering and flowing, covered with patterns that looked like ripples on a pond's surface, like the play of light through clear water, like the foam of small waves. When Chalchiuhtlicue walked, small pools of water appeared where her feet touched the ground, and from these pools grew tender green plants, their leaves unfurling toward the sun. When she laughed, it sounded like the babbling of a cheerful brook over smooth stones. When she sang, rivers changed their courses to listen, and rain fell gently across the land, not in storm but in blessing. She embodied water in all its forms, but particularly water at its most gentle and life-giving, water as nurturer rather than destroyer. The gods created for Chalchiuhtlicue a divine dwelling place in the mountains, for it was from the mountains that all waters flowed. This place was called Tlalocan, the paradise of the rain gods, and it existed in a realm that touched the mortal world but remained separate from it, accessible only to the gods and to the souls of those who died deaths associated with water. Tlalocan was a place of eternal springtime, where flowers bloomed perpetually and fruit hung always ripe on every tree. Streams ran clear and cold through meadows of soft grass. The air was warm but not hot, cool but never cold, perfect in every way. In Tlalocan, Chalchiuhtlicue had her palace, built not of stone but of flowing water that had been given form and substance through divine will. Its walls were waterfalls, falling eternally yet never depleting. Its floors were pools of the clearest water, so transparent you could see the mosaic patterns of jade and turquoise tiles beneath. Its roof was mist, soft and gentle, protecting without confining. Light filtered through the watery walls in shifting patterns, painting everything in shades of blue and green and silver. Here in her water palace, Chalchiuhtlicue tended to her many responsibilities. She was not a goddess who rested or who took her duties lightly. She understood that all life depended upon the careful distribution of water. Too little and the land would dry up, crops would fail, people would thirst and die. Too much and floods would destroy homes, wash away fields, drown the innocent. Balance was everything, and maintaining that balance required constant attention, careful judgment, and deep compassion. From her palace in Tlalocan, Chalchiuhtlicue could see all the waters of the world. She could look into any river and see its entire length from mountain source to ocean mouth. She could peer into any lake and know every fish that swam within it, every plant that grew along its shore. She could follow the underground rivers that flowed through darkness, bringing water to springs and wells. Nothing that occurred in or near water escaped her notice, and she cared deeply about those who depended upon her waters. Unlike some gods who remained distant from mortals, viewing them as insignificant or merely useful for offerings and worship, Chalchiuhtlicue felt genuine love and concern for the people who lived in the world below. She understood their struggles, their fears, their hopes. She knew that a mother carrying water from the well worried about whether the spring would run dry. She knew that a farmer planting maize seeds prayed for rain to come at the right time. She knew that a pregnant woman dipping her hands in cool stream water sought not just physical refreshment but spiritual blessing. Perhaps Chalchiuhtlicue's greatest role, the one that defined her most profoundly, was as protector of newborn children and guardian of women in childbirth. Birth was a dangerous time in the ancient world. Many women died bringing new life into being, and many babies did not survive their first breaths. The process of birth itself was seen as a battle, a dangerous crossing from one realm to another, from the water of the womb into the air of the living world. And so Chalchiuhtlicue became the divine midwife, the celestial guardian present at every birth. When a woman's labor began, midwives would invoke Chalchiuhtlicue's name, asking for her protection and assistance. They would prepare water, clean, pure water, for the washing of the newborn. This washing was not merely a physical cleansing but a sacred ritual, a baptism of sorts, welcoming the child into the world under the goddess's protection. The midwife would take the baby, still wet from birth, and would speak to Chalchiuhtlicue, saying prayers that had been passed down through countless generations. "O precious lady, Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of waters, we present to you this new soul, fresh from the divine realm. Cleanse this child of any impurity carried from the world of spirits. Bless this child with health and strength. Let your waters wash over this small one and grant the gift of life, pure and bright and full of possibility." Then the midwife would pour water over the baby 3 times, once for the head, once for the chest, once for the feet, and each time the water touched the infant's skin, it was believed that Chalchiuhtlicue herself touched the child with blessing. The water used in this ceremony was often drawn from a sacred spring or a particularly pure stream, and it was believed to carry special powers of protection. Parents would sometimes keep a small amount of this water in a special vessel, using it later if the child fell ill or needed spiritual protection. But Chalchiuhtlicue's care did not end with birth. She remained the protector of children throughout their early years, especially guarding them against illnesses related to water. If a child developed a fever, healers would perform a ceremony called hydromancy, using water to diagnose the problem and call upon Chalchiuhtlicue to heal the child. They would place a bowl of pure water before an image of the goddess, would speak the child's name over the water, and would watch how the water rippled and moved, reading in its patterns clues about what ailed the child and how to cure it. The goddess was also invoked to find a child's tonality, their spiritual essence or life force, if it became lost or weakened. The Aztecs believed that a person's tonality could become separated from the body through fright or illness, and that a weakened tonality left one vulnerable to further harm. Water, as Chalchiuhtlicue's domain, could reveal where the tonality had gone and how to retrieve it. Healers would use water from a stream where the child had played, or water from near the child's home, believing that the goddess could guide the tonality back to its proper place through her aqueous connections. Beyond her role with children, Chalchiuhtlicue was intimately connected with the fertility of the land. The Aztec Empire was built in the Valley of Mexico, a highland plateau surrounded by mountains, where water was always precious and its management essential for survival. The Aztecs developed sophisticated systems of irrigation, building canals and aqueducts, creating chinampas floating gardens in the lakes, carefully directing every drop of available water to where it was most needed. All of these hydraulic works were seen as being under Chalchiuhtlicue's divine patronage. Before building a new canal, priests would make offerings to her, asking permission to redirect her waters. When opening a new irrigation ditch, they would perform ceremonies to invoke her blessing, ensuring the water would flow where it was needed. At planting time, farmers would pray to both Tlaloc for rain from above and Chalchiuhtlicue for water in the ground, understanding that crops needed both to flourish. The Aztec agricultural year was intimately tied to water, and thus to Chalchiuhtlicue. In the dry season, from November through April, when rain was scarce and the land grew parched, special ceremonies were held to honor the water gods and encourage them to send moisture. In the rainy season, from May through October, when water was abundant, ceremonies celebrated the gift of rain and asked for it to continue in appropriate measure. One of the most important festivals dedicated to Chalchiuhtlicue occurred in February, during the month the Aztecs called Atlqualo, which meant the ceasing of water, or when water is raised up. This was a critical time, near the end of the dry season, when water reserves were at their lowest and people anxiously awaited the return of the rains. The festival lasted the entire month and involved elaborate ceremonies, feasting, fasting, and sacrifices designed to please the water deities and ensure that rain would come when needed. During Chalchiuhtlicue, priests would perform ritual reenactments of water-related myths. They would dress in costumes representing Chalchiuhtlicue and other water deities, wearing jade-colored garments and headdresses adorned with quetzal feathers and paper cutouts painted to look like water. These priests would process through the streets of Tenochtitlan, the great Aztec capital, blessing water sources and reminding people of the god's importance. The priests would go to Lake Texcoco, the great body of water on which Tenochtitlan was built, and would dive into its cold waters, imitating the movements of frogs and other water creatures, croaking and calling in imitation of their sounds. This sympathetic magic was meant to attract Chalchiuhtlicue's attention and remind her of the water creatures who depended on her, and by extension, remind her of the human creatures who also needed her care. Offerings were made to Chalchiuhtlicue throughout the year, but especially during Chalchiuhtlicue. People would bring precious things to cast into Lake Texcoco or into sacred springs: jade beads, turquoise stones, seashells brought from the distant ocean, rubber balls, incense, and flowers. These offerings were given with prayers and songs, with genuine gratitude for the water that sustained life, and with genuine hope that the goddess would continue to provide what was needed. The relationship between Chalchiuhtlicue and her worshippers was not one of fear and appeasement, as with some Aztec deities who were seen primarily as dangerous and needing to be placated. Rather, it was more like the relationship between loving children and a nurturing mother. Yes, there was respect, even awe, for her power. Yes, there was awareness that water could be dangerous, could flood and drown and destroy. But primarily there was love and gratitude, recognition of her as a generous provider, a protector, a source of life itself. This maternal aspect of Chalchiuhtlicue was reflected in the art and iconography dedicated to her. When Aztec sculptors carved statues of the goddess, they showed her in a kneeling position, which was associated with femininity and particularly with the posture women adopted during childbirth. Her face in these sculptures was serene, beautiful in a maternal way rather than in a distant, cold way. She looked approachable, kind, someone to whom one could bring one's troubles and find understanding. One magnificent statue of Chalchiuhtlicue, carved from green stone and standing over 3 feet tall, was discovered in the 19th century buried beneath the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan, the great ancient city that predated the Aztecs but whose ruins they revered as a sacred site. This statue, now housed in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, shows the goddess in her classic pose kneeling, wearing her distinctive headdress of cotton bands trimmed with amaranth seeds, with large round tassels hanging on either side of her head, and dressed in her jade-colored skirt. But what makes this statue particularly striking is the expression on Chalchiuhtlicue's face. Despite being carved from stone, despite the stylization common in Aztec art, there is something deeply human and deeply compassionate in her features. Her eyes seem to look with understanding and sympathy. Her mouth, though unsmiling as was the norm in Aztec sculpture, does not look stern or disapproving. She looks like someone who would listen to prayers with genuine interest, someone who would help if she possibly could. She looks, in short, like the mother goddess she was believed to be. In codices, the painted books created by Aztec artists and scribes, Chalchiuhtlicue was depicted in ways that emphasized her connection to water. Artists would show her sitting with water flowing from beneath her skirt, spreading out to form rivers and streams. They would paint her garments in shades of blue and green, covering them with the wavy lines and spirals that symbolized water in Aztec iconography. They would show droplets falling from her, or show her surrounded by the symbols for springs and rivers and lakes. Her headdress in these images was particularly elaborate and distinctive. It consisted of multiple bands of what was probably cotton, wound around the head in a specific pattern unique to Chalchiuhtlicue. These bands were bordered with small round objects that might represent amaranth seeds or small jade beads. From the sides hung 2 large tassels, and from the back twisted cords fell down, sometimes with additional tassels or ornaments at their ends. This headdress was so distinctive that even a simple painting of this headdress alone would immediately identify the image as representing Chalchiuhtlicue. She was often shown wearing a nose plug, a common ornament in Aztec culture, usually made of turquoise or jade. Her earrings were large and elaborate, sometimes shown as circular ornaments, sometimes as more complex designs. Around her neck hung multiple strands of jade beads, emphasizing her connection to this precious stone that symbolized water, fertility, and life itself. Sometimes Chalchiuhtlicue was depicted with black markings on her face, lines on the cheeks or around the mouth. These markings had specific meaning in Aztec symbolism, though their exact interpretation varied. Some scholars believe they represented water or moisture. Others think they might have indicated her connection to the earth and fertility. Still others suggest they were simply conventional signs that identified her as a water deity, similar to how Tlaloc was shown with distinctive goggle-like circles around his eyes and fangs in his mouth. In some depictions, particularly those that emphasized her role in the creation myths, Chalchiuhtlicue was shown with serpents. This association made sense to the Aztecs, who connected serpents strongly with water. Serpents moved in sinuous, flowing ways that reminded people of water. Serpents often lived near water sources. And in Aztec mythology, there was a deep symbolic connection between serpents, water, and the earth's fertility. The undulating movement of a snake across the ground was seen as similar to the movement of water across the land, and both were associated with the life-giving forces of nature. Yet despite all this artistic representation, despite all the temples built in her honor, despite all the ceremonies and offerings and prayers, Chalchiuhtlicue remained somewhat mysterious, somewhat elusive, in a way that befitted a water deity. Water itself is mysterious. It can be seen and felt, but it slips through grasping fingers. It can be diverted but never truly captured. It follows its own laws, finding paths through the smallest cracks, gathering in low places, always seeking equilibrium, always moving, always changing while remaining essentially the same. And so too was Chalchiuhtlicue. She could be invoked and prayed to, but she could not be commanded. She could be generous with her blessings, but her generosity came from her own divine will, not from mortal manipulation. She could be understood, but never completely, for like water itself, she always held depths that remained hidden, mysteries that could not be fully plumbed. The Age of the Fourth Sun. But perhaps the most important story of Chalchiuhtlicue, the tale that truly defined her role in the cosmos and in the hearts of those who worshipped her, was the story of the fourth sun, the age when she ruled as the sun itself, the age that would end in transformation and begin the journey toward the world we know today. The Aztecs believed that the universe had been created, destroyed, and recreated multiple times. Each creation was called a sun, and each sun was ruled by a different deity and had its own characteristics. Each sun eventually ended in catastrophe, clearing the way for the next creation. This cyclical view of time and existence was fundamental to Aztec philosophy and shaped how they understood their place in the cosmos. The first sun, called Nahue Ocelotl or Four Jaguar, was ruled by Tezcatlipoca. It was an age when giants walked the earth, feeding on acorns rather than maize. This sun lasted for 676 years before Quetzalcoatl knocked Tezcatlipoca from the sky with a stick. In his rage and humiliation, Tezcatlipoca transformed himself into a jaguar and commanded all the jaguars of the world to devour the giants. The first sun ended in darkness and teeth and blood. The second sun, called Nahue Ehecatl or Four Wind, was ruled by Quetzalcoatl. This was an age when people lived on piñon nuts rather than maize. This sun lasted for 364 years before Tezcatlipoca took his revenge, using his sorcery to knock Quetzalcoatl from his position as the sun. Terrible hurricanes arose, winds so powerful they knocked down all the trees and scattered the people. Those few who survived were transformed into monkeys, condemned to live in the trees, barely remembering their former humanity. The third sun, called Chalchiuhtlicue or Fore-Rain, was ruled by Tlaloc, the rain god and Chalchiuhtlicue's companion. This was an age of beginnings of agriculture, though people still had not learned to cultivate maize. This sun lasted for 312 years. Various myths tell different stories about its ending, but most agree it involved Tezcatlipoca somehow causing trouble, perhaps stealing Tlaloc's wife, perhaps simply sowing discord among the gods. The third sun ended in a rain of fire, perhaps referring to volcanic eruptions that burned the world and transformed survivors into birds, turkeys, butterflies, and dogs. And then came the fourth sun, and this was Chalchiuhtlicue's time. This age was called Nahuatl, meaning for water, and the goddess of waters herself became the sun, bringing her gentle, nurturing energy to the heavens, casting her benevolent gaze across the world below. The fourth sun was, by all accounts, a blessed age. Under Chalchiuhtlicue's rule, water was abundant and well distributed. The lands were green and fertile. Rivers ran full and clean. Lakes teemed with fish. Springs bubbled up in convenient locations, providing fresh water to all who needed it. The people of this age did not suffer from drought or thirst. They built their homes near water sources and learned to work with water, to channel it and use it wisely. It was during the fourth sun that maize first appeared in the world, that sacred grain that would become the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization, the crop around which entire cultures would be built. According to myth, Quetzalcoatl discovered maize hidden inside a mountain, protected by ants who had found it first. The feathered serpent transformed himself into a black ant and followed the other ants into the mountain, where he found the golden kernels of maize and brought them back to share with humanity. Under Chalchiuhtlicue's benevolent sun, this maize flourished. The people learned to plant it, to tend it, to harvest it. They learned to grind the kernels into flour, to make the flat cakes called tlaxcali, which would later be known by the Spanish name tortilla, to prepare it in dozens of different ways. Maize became sacred to them, became identified with life itself, and they gave thanks to Chalchiuhtlicue for providing the water that allowed it to grow. The fourth sun was an age of abundance, an age of harmony between the gods and humanity, an age when people could live without the constant fear of starvation or catastrophe that had marked previous ages. Chalchiuhtlicue looked down from her position as the sun and felt love for the people below. She saw their struggles and their joys, their births and their deaths, their daily labors and their celebrations. She provided water generously, neither withholding it through drought nor overwhelming them with floods. She maintained perfect balance, perfect harmony. The people of the fourth sun honored Chalchiuhtlicue with devotion and genuine affection. They built temples in her honor, places where they could come to offer thanks and prayers. These temples were often located near water sources, beside lakes, near springs, along major rivers, emphasizing the connection between the goddess and her domain. Inside these temples, priests and priestesses maintained her worship, keeping fires burning, making daily offerings, singing the sacred songs that had been composed in her honor. The people gave Chalchiuhtlicue gifts from their hearts, jade beads carefully carved and polished, representing wealth given willingly to honor her. Turquoise stones, precious and rare, symbols of sky and water combined. Seashells brought from the distant coasts, carried across mountains and through valleys by traders, proof of the extent to which people would go to honor the goddess. Fresh flowers, especially water lilies and other aquatic plants that grew in her domain. Incense that filled the air with sweet smoke, carrying prayers upward toward the heavens. And songs, beautiful songs of praise and thanksgiving, of love and devotion, sung by voices lifted in genuine worship rather than fear. In return for this worship, Chalchiuhtlicue continued to bless the people. When a woman became pregnant, she would make offerings to Chalchiuhtlicue and pray for a safe delivery and a healthy child. When a farmer planted his fields, he would invoke her name and ask for water at the proper times. When a family dug a new well, they would perform a small ceremony to Chalchiuhtlicue, asking her to guide them to a good water source and to keep that source pure and abundant. The fourth sun lasted for 676 years, the same length as the first sun had lasted, a complete cycle in the complex Aztec calendar system. For 676 years, Chalchiuhtlicue reigned as the sun, and for 676 years, the world knew abundance and harmony. The people grew numerous and prosperous. They built cities and temples. They created works of art and developed complex philosophical and religious systems. They looked up at Chalchiuhtlicue shining in the heavens and felt secure, felt blessed, felt that their world would continue forever under her loving care. But in the realm of the gods, trouble was brewing. The other deities, particularly those who had ruled previous suns and lost their positions, watched Chalchiuhtlicue's success with mixed emotions. Some were genuinely happy for her and for the humans who flourished under her care. But others felt envy, felt that her time and power had lasted long enough, felt that she should be brought down as others had been brought down before her. Chief among these jealous gods was Chalchiuhtlicue, the smoking mirror, who had caused the downfall of previous suns and who seemed to delight in disruption and change. Chalchiuhtlicue was not evil in the way that word is often understood. He was more complicated than that, more nuanced. He represented necessary change, the destruction that must precede new creation, the darkness that gives meaning to light. But he was also capricious, unpredictable, sometimes cruel in his methods even when his ultimate purposes might serve the greater cosmic balance. Chalchiuhtlicue watched Chalchiuhtlicue and observed how the people loved her, how they thrived under her care. And a plan began to form in his divine mind, a plan that would bring about change, that would end the fourth sun and make way for the fifth, that would teach important lessons about the nature of divinity and the complexity of existence. One day Chalchiuhtlicue approached Chalchiuhtlicue in her palace in Tlalocan. He came in friendly guise, smiling, appearing to be concerned rather than malicious. "Sister," he said to her, for all the gods were in some sense family, all descended from the same primordial sources, "I must speak with you about something that troubles me. It concerns your relationship with the mortals below." Chalchiuhtlicue received him graciously, offered him refreshment, asked what troubled him. She had no reason to suspect Chalchiuhtlicue's motives. Yes, she knew of his history, knew of the chaos he had caused in previous ages, but she did not think he would turn his troublemaking toward her. She was the goddess of water, essential and beloved. What could he possibly gain by opposing her? "I have been watching from afar," Chalchiuhtlicue said, his voice smooth and reasonable, "and I have observed the people's devotion to you. They bring you offerings, they sing your praises, they build temples in your honor. All of this seems good and right. But sister, I must ask you a difficult question. Do you truly care for them? Or do you simply enjoy their worship, their adoration, their gifts?" Chalchiuhtlicue was taken aback by this question. "Of course I care for them," she replied. "I love the people as a mother loves her children. I provide water not because I desire worship but because they need water to live. I protect mothers and babies not for the offerings they give me but because birth is dangerous and they need divine protection. How can you even ask such a question?" Chalchiuhtlicue shook his head slowly, sadly, as if regretting what he had to say next. "I ask because others have noticed something, sister. They have observed that you provide water most generously to those who give you the finest offerings. That you pay most attention to those cities and villages where your temples are grandest and your worship most elaborate. Is it possible, sister, that without realizing it, you have allowed yourself to become attached to the worship itself rather than to the worshippers?" "That is not true," Chalchiuhtlicue exclaimed, distressed by the accusation. "I provide water where it is needed, when it is needed, without regard to offerings or worship. Yes, I am pleased when people honor me, but their honor does not determine my blessing. I would provide water to those who never worshiped me at all, if they needed it to survive." "Would you truly?" Chalchiuhtlicue asked, his voice full of false sympathy and concern. "Or is that what you tell yourself, sister? Is it possible that you have deceived yourself, That you have come to believe your own motivations are pure when in fact they are tainted by vanity and a desire for adoration? Think carefully, Chalchiuhtlicue. Search your heart. Are you absolutely certain that your love for humanity is genuine? This question struck Chalchiuhtlicue like a blow to the heart. She thought of all the ceremonies and offerings, all the prayers and worship that rose up to her daily. Could it be true? Could she have been motivated more by vanity than by genuine love? She tried to think back to specific instances when she had provided water, tried to remember if she had unconsciously favored places where worship was strongest. The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. How could anyone truly know their own motivations? How could anyone be absolutely certain that their actions were pure and unselfish? I believe I truly care, she said slowly, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time. I have always believed I acted out of love. But now you make me question myself. How can I know for certain? Aztec pressed his advantage. That very doubt, sister, proves my point. A God who truly loved without reservation would have no doubt at all. The fact that you question yourself suggests that deep down, you know the truth, that you have been performing kindness to earn worship rather than giving kindness freely. You have been false to the people, Chalchiuhtlicue. You have made them believe you love them when in fact you merely love their adoration. Now this accusation was absolutely false. Aztec was lying, manipulating, twisting truth into something that resembled truth but was fundamentally wrong. Chalchiuhtlicue did genuinely love the people. Her care for them was real and deep and sincere. She had never withheld water to punish lack of worship, had never demanded offerings before providing what was needed. But Aztec was clever, and his words were designed to create exactly the kind of doubt and confusion that would undermine Chalchiuhtlicue's confidence and sense of self. And it worked. Chalchiuhtlicue felt her certainty crumbling. If she could question herself even for a moment, did that mean the accusation had some truth to it? If she wasn't absolutely sure of her own motivations, did that mean she had been deceiving herself? The more she tried to prove to herself that her love was genuine, the more tangled her thoughts became, the more difficult it was to find solid ground on which to stand. I do not know, she finally said, her voice breaking. I thought I knew my own heart, but now I am not sure. Have I truly been false to the people? Have I failed in my duties as a goddess? Have I been living a lie all these centuries? The tears began then, slowly at first. A few drops escaped from Chalchiuhtlicue's blue-green eyes and rolled down her cheeks. These were tears of confusion and hurt, tears of a goddess who had believed herself to be good and loving, suddenly doubting everything she thought she knew about herself. And because Chalchiuhtlicue was the goddess of water, because she was in a profound sense water itself given divine form and consciousness, her tears were not like the tears of a human or even of another god. Her tears were water in its purest form, water imbued with divine essence, water that could not simply fall and disappear but instead had power and presence. Aztec, seeing that his words had achieved their goal, departed. He had set in motion what he had intended to set in motion. The rest would unfold without his further interference. He had planted a seed of doubt in Chalchiuhtlicue's heart, and that seed would grow like a vine, spreading and tangling, until it consumed her certainty and her peace. Alone in her palace in Tlalocan, Chalchiuhtlicue wept. She tried to stop, tried to compose herself, but the tears would not cease. The doubt Aztec had planted burrowed deeper into her heart with every moment. Had she truly loved the people, or had she only loved their worship? Was her care genuine, or was it performance? Every memory she searched through became suspect, every kindness she had performed now seeming possibly tainted by ulterior motives. The tears flowed faster, streaming down her face, dripping from her chin, falling to the floor of her water palace where they joined with the pools and streams that formed its structure. And as Chalchiuhtlicue's tears merged with her domain, they began to spread outward, flowing down the mountains toward the lands below, joining with the rivers and streams that connected all waters across the face of the earth. the flood of tears. In the world below, in the lands where the people of the fourth sun lived their lives, the first signs of change were subtle. A stream that usually ran clear suddenly carried an unusual quality. The water tasted different, salter, as if mixed with tears. A lake that had been calm suddenly developed small ripples without any wind to cause them, as if something beneath the surface was disturbing the water. Springs bubbled up more forcefully than usual, as if pressure was building somewhere deep underground. At first, no one was particularly concerned. Water behaved unpredictably sometimes, that was simply its nature. But as days passed, the changes became more pronounced. Rivers began to swell, their levels rising even though no rain had fallen. Lakes expanded beyond their normal boundaries, lapping at shorelines they had never reached before. Wells that had always provided just enough water suddenly overflowed, creating new streams where none had existed. People began to worry. They offered prayers to Chalchiuhtlicue, asking if they had somehow offended her, seeking to understand what was happening. But their prayers went unanswered, for Chalchiuhtlicue, lost in her grief and confusion in her palace above, was barely aware of the world below. She was consumed by her doubt, by her anguish at the possibility that she had been false, that her entire existence had been based on a lie. And still she wept. Day after day, night after night, without ceasing, without pause. Her tears were endless, inexhaustible, flowing from the deep well of her pain and confusion. Some accounts say that her tears were tinged with blood, not red blood like that of humans, but the blue-green blood of divinity, making her tears look like jade dissolved in clear water. Whether or not this detail is true, the effect of her weeping was undeniable and catastrophic. The waters of the world continued to rise. Streams became rivers. Rivers became torrents. Lakes became inland seas. The carefully maintained irrigation systems the people had built became useless as water overflowed every channel, every dam, every carefully constructed waterway. Fields flooded, drowning the maize plants that had not yet been harvested. Houses built near water, which meant most houses, for everyone wanted to be close to water sources, were inundated, forcing families to flee to higher ground. But there was no true high ground that stayed dry for long. The water kept rising, relentless and unstoppable. Villages that had stood for generations were abandoned as their inhabitants moved to hilltops. Cities built on elevated platforms found their foundations underwater. Even mountains began to be submerged as the water level rose higher and higher, defying all natural laws, responding not to physical principles but to the divine grief of a goddess who could not stop crying. The people did not understand what was happening. They had not offended Chalchiuhtlicue, they had continued their worship as always, had made their offerings faithfully, had lived according to the customs and traditions that honored the gods. Why then was this happening? Why would their beloved goddess, who had always protected them, who had always provided water in appropriate measure, suddenly drown them in an endless deluge? Some priests and wise people began to suspect that something had happened in the divine realm, that this flood was not punishment but rather some kind of cosmic catastrophe that went beyond human understanding or human causation. They continued to pray, but their prayers shifted from seeking forgiveness for unknown offenses to simply asking for mercy, for the flood to stop, for their goddess to remember them and take pity on their plight. In Tlalocan, in her palace of flowing water and gentle mist, Chalchiuhtlicue wept on. Time moved differently in the divine realm, and what seemed like days to the gods might be years in the mortal world below. The goddess was aware dimly that something was wrong, that her tears were causing problems, but she could not seem to stop them. The doubt had taken root too deeply. The pain was too intense. The fear that she had been false, that everything she had believed about herself was wrong, was too overwhelming to overcome. And so the water rose. For 52 years it rose, 52 years being a complete cycle in the Aztec calendar, a full turning of the great cosmic wheel, a number that held sacred significance. For 52 years, Chalchiuhtlicue wept tears that flooded the world, drowning the fourth sun in sorrow and bringing that age to its close. The people struggled to survive. They built boats and rafts, constructing floating homes when the land disappeared beneath the waves. They became skilled at fishing, for fish were abundant in the new water world, and fish could provide food when crops could no longer be grown. They developed new skills, new adaptations, learning to live in a world that was now more water than land. But human bodies were not designed for an entirely aquatic existence. The cold and damp brought illnesses. The constant motion of boats and rafts was exhausting. The psychological toll of watching the familiar world disappear beneath rising waters, of losing homes and fields and temples, was immense. People suffered, not because they were being punished but because they were caught in circumstances beyond their control, victims of divine drama playing out on a cosmic scale. Chalchiuhtlicue, in those brief moments when she could think beyond her own pain, looked down at what her tears had wrought and felt new anguish. She saw the suffering she was causing, saw people struggling and dying, saw the beautiful world of the fourth sun being destroyed by her inability to stop crying. This knowledge made her weep harder, for now she felt guilty not only for possibly being false before but for definitely causing harm now. A terrible cycle had begun, grief causing harm, harm causing more grief causing more tears causing more harm. But something began to happen to the people caught in this endless flood, something miraculous and strange and fundamentally transforming. Those who had been completely submerged, those who had drowned or who had given up struggling and let the water take them, did not die, or rather they died to one form of existence but were reborn into another. Their human bodies shifted and changed, bones restructuring, skin transforming into scales, legs fusing and forming fins, arms reshaping into flexible appendages suited for swimming. They became fish, beautiful fish of many kinds, each person transformed into a form that somehow suited who they had been in life. Those who had been swift and active became quicksilver fish that darted through the water in flashing schools. Those who had been contemplative and slow to act became large, ponderous fish that moved through the depths with majestic patience. Those who had been beautiful became fish with brilliantly colored scales that shimmered in the filtered sunlight. Those who had been strong became powerful fish with thick bodies and commanding presence. This transformation was Chalchiuhtlicue's final gift to her people, though she did not consciously choose to give it. It flowed from her essential nature as a goddess who loved and protected, from her deep unwillingness to let those she cared for simply die and disappear. If they could not live as humans in a world of water, then they would live as fish, dwelling in her domain, remaining under her protection even in their transformed state. The newly transformed fish people, for they were not quite human anymore but not entirely fish either, retaining some memory and consciousness of their previous existence, found that they could breathe underwater, could find food in the new aquatic environment, could live in this flood-drowned world. They swam through the ruins of their former cities, past the tops of submerged temples, through forests that now existed underwater, their trees reaching up toward a surface that was far, far above. And gradually, as more and more people were transformed into fish, as the world became more fully adapted to its new aquatic state, something shifted in Chalchiuhtlicue's consciousness. She began to see that while the fourth sun was ending, life was not ending. The people continued, albeit in changed form. Her domain of water had expanded to encompass the entire world, and in a strange way, this meant that more than ever before, everyone lived within her care, within her protection, within the embrace of the element she embodied. The realization brought no immediate end to her tears. 52 years had to complete their full cycle, but it brought a subtle shift in their quality. They were no longer purely tears of grief and confusion but became mixed with something else, perhaps acceptance, perhaps understanding that transformation was not the same as destruction, that endings opened the way for new beginnings. As the 52nd year drew to its close, as the great calendar cycle prepared to turn over and begin anew, Chalchiuhtlicue's tears finally began to slow. The doubt that Tezcatlipoca had planted still troubled her, that wound would take longer to heal, but she began to find a measure of peace. She looked down at the water world her tears had created and saw that it was, in its own way, beautiful. The fish people swam through clear waters, their scales catching the light filtering down from above, living lives that were different from before but still lives worth living. The goddess made a decision. Some of her people, those who had been especially righteous, especially devoted, especially true in heart, would not be transformed into fish. For these chosen ones, she created a bridge, a divine pathway that stretched from the flooded earth up to the heavens, allowing them to ascend to Tlalocan, to her paradise, where they could live in eternal comfort, walking on dry land once more, breathing air, existing in the blessed realm where she dwelt. This bridge shimmered in the air, made of mist and light and divine will. Those who were judged worthy could see it and could climb its gentle slope, rising up out of the water, ascending higher and higher until they passed through the boundary between mortal and divine realms and found themselves in the meadows of Tlalocan, where flowers bloomed eternally and fruit always hung ripe on the trees. Not many could make this journey. The criteria for being judged worthy were exacting, but those who did found peace and joy in Chalchiuhtlicue's paradise. They became attendants in her water palace, helping to maintain the streams and pools, caring for the gardens, singing the songs that she loved. They were no longer entirely human, but they were no longer entirely mortal either, existing in a state somewhere between the two, blessed and protected forever. For the rest, the vast majority who had been transformed into fish, life continued in the underwater world. They adapted, they flourished, they found meaning in their transformed existence. And Chalchiuhtlicue watched over them all, her love for them finally clear and certain in her own heart. Whatever doubt Tezcatlipoca had planted, whatever uncertainty had caused her to weep for 52 years, she knew now with absolute conviction that she cared for these people, that she always had cared, that her love was genuine and deep and unshakable. The fourth sun was ended, drowned in tears, transformed into a world of water and fish. But it was not destroyed with cruelty or malice. It was transformed through grief, yes, but also through love, love that could not bear to let the people simply die, love that found a way to preserve life even in the midst of catastrophic change. The fifth sun and after. When Chalchiuhtlicue's tears finally ceased completely, when the 52nd year ended and the great calendar cycle turned over, the gods gathered to determine what would happen next. The fourth sun had ended, as all suns must end, making way for the next creation, the next attempt to build a world that could endure. The gods met at Teotihuacan, the place where gods become, a sacred site that existed in both the divine and mortal realms simultaneously. Teotihuacan was a place of pyramids and plazas, of carefully aligned temples and sacred geometries, a place designed to facilitate communication between earth and heaven, between mortal and divine. In the darkness left by the ending of the fourth sun, the gods debated who would become the next sun, who would have the honor and the burden of lighting the sky and providing warmth and life to whatever new world would emerge. The choice fell to two volunteers, Chalchiuhtlicue, a wealthy and proud god who offered himself confidently, certain of his worthiness, and Nanahuatzin, a humble god, poor and afflicted with sores, who offered himself out of pure devotion and willingness to serve. A great fire was built in the center of Teotihuacan, flames rising high into the darkness, heat radiating outward in shimmering waves. To become the sun, one of the gods would have to sacrifice himself, leaping into the fire, allowing himself to be consumed and transformed, dying to one form of existence to be reborn as the celestial body that would light the fifth sun. Chalchiuhtlicue went first, but despite his confidence and pride, when he approached the fire and felt its terrible heat, he faltered. 4 times he tried to leap into the flames, and 4 times his courage failed him. He could not make himself take that final step, could not force himself to embrace the pain and destruction that would precede his transformation. Then Nanahuatzin, the humble god, stepped forward. Without hesitation, without pause, he ran toward the fire and leaped into its heart. The flames consumed him instantly, and from the ashes of his sacrifice, a new sun was born to Nidiu, the fifth sun, the sun that shines in the sky today, the sun under which we all live. Ashamed by his cowardice, Chalchiuhtlicue finally found the courage to follow, leaping into the dying embers of the fire. But because he had hesitated, because he had gone second, he did not become a sun but instead became the moon, bright but not as bright as the sun, beautiful but reflecting rather than generating light. With the fifth sun established in the heavens, the floodwaters that had covered the world began slowly to recede. It took time. The water could not simply vanish after all, but had to flow somewhere, had to find new places to settle. Gradually, land began to emerge from beneath the waves. First the highest mountain peaks, then ridges and plateaus, then valleys and plains. The water drained into basins that became the new lakes, flowed down channels that became the new rivers, settled into hollows that became the new springs and ponds. The fish people found that as the land re-emerged, some felt drawn to stay in the water, to remain in the form they had taken, to continue their aquatic existence. They became the ancestors of all fish, all water-dwelling creatures, their distant descendants losing the last traces of human consciousness but retaining something in their nature that connected them to the people who had lived under the fourth sun. But others felt drawn to the newly dry land, felt a longing to walk on earth again, to breathe air directly rather than through gills. These fish people underwent a second transformation, gradually, painfully, wonderfully. Their scales softened and became skin. Their fins separated and formed legs and arms again. Their gills closed and lungs opened. They emerged from the water, walking hesitantly at first on legs that remembered how to walk but had to relearn the skill. They became the first people of the fifth sun, the ancestors of all the humans who would live in this new age. These newly reformed humans carried within them the memory of their time as fish, their time underwater, their time of transformation. They remembered, dimly, the fourth sun and Chalchiuhtlicue's rule. They remembered being drowned in tears and being saved by transformation. They remembered living in water and then returning to land. These memories became stories, and the stories became myths, and the myths became the foundation of their understanding of the world and their place within it. Chalchiuhtlicue herself did not become the sun of the fifth age. That honor and burden belonged to Nidiu now. But she remained an essential goddess, arguably more important than ever, for the people of the fifth sun needed water just as urgently as the people of the fourth sun had. Perhaps more urgently, for the fifth sun was hotter and fiercer than the fourth had been, evaporating water more quickly, making drought a constant threat. The goddess returned to her role as provider and protector of water. She dwelt still in Tlalocan, in her palace of waterfalls and mist. She still watched over all the rivers and lakes and streams of the world. She still protected mothers and newborns. She still blessed the land with fertility. But she did so with a new understanding, a new depth of wisdom born from her experience with the fourth sun. Chalchiuhtlicue understood now that love could be tested, that even genuine devotion could be questioned, that certainty could be shaken by doubt. She understood that grief and joy were intertwined, that endings and beginnings were part of the same cycle, that transformation and preservation were not opposites but complementary aspects of existence. She also understood, though it had cost her dearly to learn, that she was not false, that her love for humanity was real and deep, that she had always cared genuinely and would always continue to care. The doubt Chalchiuhtlicue had planted had grown into a terrible vine that nearly strangled her, but in struggling with it, in facing it, in suffering through its effects, she had ultimately proven to herself that her love was real. A false goddess would not have wept for 52 years. A false goddess would not have transformed her people into fish rather than let them die. A false goddess would not have built a bridge to paradise for the worthy. Her actions, even in her moment of greatest doubt and confusion, had revealed the truth of her heart. The people of the fifth sun honored Chalchiuhtlicue with even greater devotion than the people of the fourth sun had shown. They understood that water was precious, that it was not to be wasted, that the goddess's gifts required gratitude and careful stewardship. They built their great city, Tenochtitlan, on an island in Lake Texcoco, surrounding themselves with water, living always within Chalchiuhtlicue's domain and under her protection. The temples they built in her honor were magnificent. The largest and most beautiful stood near the shore of Lake Texcoco, constructed from carefully cut stone, painted in shades of blue and green and white, decorated with carvings of water symbols, spirals and waves, droplets and streams, fish and shells and all things aquatic. Stairs climbed the pyramid's face, leading to a shrine at the top where priests maintained perpetual worship. Inside this shrine stood a statue of Chalchiuhtlicue, carved from the finest green stone, polished until it shone like water itself, dressed in miniature versions of her sacred garments, the jade skirt, the tasseled headdress, the jade beads. Before this statue, offerings were placed daily, flowers always fresh, incense always burning, jade beads and turquoise stones presented with prayers and songs. The ceremonies in Chalchiuhtlicue's honor became more elaborate in the fifth sun. During Atalqualo, the month dedicated to water deities, the entire city participated in celebrations that lasted for days. Priests dressed as Chalchiuhtlicue would process through the streets, blessing water sources, visiting homes to bless newborn children, leading songs and dances that had been passed down through generations. One of the most moving ceremonies involved the priests diving into Lake Texcoco, immersing themselves completely in the goddess's domain, emerging renewed and purified. They would imitate the sounds and movements of frogs and other water creatures, acts of sympathetic magic designed to encourage Chalchiuhtlicue's favor and ensure that water would be plentiful in the coming season. Another ceremony involved mothers bringing their newborn children to the water's edge. The midwife who had assisted at the birth would hold the baby and speak to Chalchiuhtlicue, introducing the new soul to the goddess who protected children. Then the midwife would scoop up water in a special vessel and pour it over the baby's head, chest, and feet, baptizing the child in Chalchiuhtlicue's name, invoking her protection for all the days of that child's life. "O Chalchiuhtlicue," the midwife would pray, "you who are the jade skirt, you who are the precious water, you who give life and sustain life, receive this child into your care. Let your pure water wash away any harm that might cling to this new soul. Let your blessing flow over this child like a gentle stream, bringing growth and health and happiness. Let this child always have water to drink, food to eat, and your loving protection in times of danger. We thank you for the gift of this life, and we place this precious child in your divine hands." The baby would often cry when the cool water touched its skin, and these cries were seen as auspicious, as proof that the child was responding to the goddess's touch, that Chalchiuhtlicue had heard the prayers and accepted the child into her protection. The water used for this baptism was carefully saved, kept in a special vessel in the family's home, to be used later if the child fell ill or needed spiritual healing. Beyond formal ceremonies, Chalchiuhtlicue was part of daily life in countless small ways. When a woman drew water from a well, she would speak a brief prayer of thanks to the goddess. When a farmer opened an irrigation gate to water his fields, he would acknowledge Chalchiuhtlicue's generosity. When someone crossed a river, whether by boat or by bridge or by wading through shallow water, they would ask the goddess for safe passage. She was not distant or abstract but intimately present in every interaction with water, every moment when water sustained or refreshed or cleansed. Children were taught from their earliest years to honor Chalchiuhtlicue. They learned to never waste water, to always be grateful for it, to treat all water sources with respect. They learned that to contaminate water was a serious offense, not just against human community but against the goddess herself. They learned the stories of the fourth sun and how Chalchiuhtlicue's tears had transformed the world, understanding from these stories both the goddess's power and her compassion. Young girls especially were taught to feel a special connection to Chalchiuhtlicue. As they approached womanhood and the possibility of becoming mothers themselves, they learned to pray to the goddess, to seek her guidance, to ask for her protection during the dangerous process of childbirth. Women would often make pilgrimages to sacred springs or to Lake Texcoco, bringing offerings, seeking blessings, hoping that Chalchiuhtlicue would smile upon them and grant them healthy children. The connection between Chalchiuhtlicue and fertility extended beyond human reproduction to agricultural fertility. Farmers understood that their crops depended entirely on water, and thus on the goddess's favor. The maize that was the foundation of their diet and their culture needed water at specific times in its growing cycle. Too little water and the plants would wither and die, leaving people to starve. Too much water and the plants would rot in the fields with the same terrible result. The balance had to be perfect, and only Chalchiuhtlicue could provide that balance. During planting season, farmers would perform small private ceremonies in their fields, making offerings to Chalchiuhtlicue and asking her to provide adequate water. They would place jade beads or turquoise stones at the corners of their fields, marking the boundaries of the space they hoped the goddess would bless. They would pour water from a sacred source over the first seeds planted, sanctifying them and asking Chalchiuhtlicue to make them grow. As the maize plants grew, farmers would watch anxiously for signs of Chalchiuhtlicue's favor. When irrigation water flowed smoothly through their ditches, they knew the goddess was pleased. When rain fell gently at the right times, they gave thanks for her generosity. But if water became scarce, if springs ran low or rivers dwindled, they would increase their offerings and prayers, worried that somehow they had offended her or that she had turned her attention elsewhere. The Aztec understanding of Chalchiuhtlicue was complex and nuanced. She was not a simple goddess who could be easily categorized as purely benevolent or purely dangerous. Like water itself, she had multiple aspects, multiple faces, multiple ways of being. Water could be life-giving or life-ending, gentle or violent, nurturing or destructive. And Chalchiuhtlicue, as the personification and embodiment of water, contained all these contradictions within her divine nature. She was the gentle rain that nourished crops, but she was also the flood that destroyed homes. She was the cool spring that quenched thirst, but she was also the whirlpool that capsized boats. She was the peaceful lake that reflected the sky, but she was also the storm that whipped up waves and drowned the unwary. To honor her properly meant to acknowledge all these aspects, to respect her power in all its forms, to understand that her nature was as complex and multifaceted as water itself. This complexity was reflected in the iconography and art dedicated to Chalchiuhtlicue. Sometimes she was shown gently and maternally, a protective figure with a serene expression, associated with birth and children and nurturing care. But other times she was shown more fearfully, her face painted with black lines that suggested power and potential danger, associated with storms and floods and the destructive capacity of water unleashed. The Aztecs developed an entire worldview around water and its sacred importance, and Chalchiuhtlicue was at the heart of this worldview. They understood that water was not simply a resource to be exploited but a sacred gift to be honored. They built their civilization around careful water management, creating systems of irrigation and drainage that were sophisticated and effective. They developed laws governing water use, ensuring that everyone had access to this essential resource while preventing any individual or group from monopolizing or contaminating it. The chinampas, the famous floating gardens of the Aztecs, were a brilliant example of how deeply the people understood water and how to work with it rather than against it. These artificial islands, created by piling mud and vegetation in shallow areas of the lakes, provided incredibly productive agricultural land while also serving as a kind of living offering to Chalchiuhtlicue. The chinampas existed at the boundary between water and earth, partaking of both elements, demonstrating humanity's ability to work in partnership with the goddess's domain. Every chinampa was surrounded by water on all sides, the crops growing in rich, moist soil while being irrigated constantly by the lake water that lapped at their edges. The people who tended these gardens understood that they were working within Chalchiuhtlicue's domain, that every plant they grew was nourished by her gift of water, that their very ability to feed their families and their city depended on maintaining right relationship with the goddess. The aqueducts that brought fresh water from springs in the hills to the city of Tenochtitlan were also seen as sacred structures, channels through which Chalchiuhtlicue's blessing flowed. The construction of these aqueducts required not just engineering skill but also proper religious observance. Priests blessed the construction at every stage, making offerings, performing ceremonies, ensuring that the work was done in harmony with the goddess's will. When water first flowed through a newly completed aqueduct, it was cause for major celebration. People would gather to watch the water arrive, would drink from it ceremonially, would thank Chalchiuhtlicue for her generosity in allowing this new channel to be built. The water from these aqueducts was considered particularly pure and sacred, suitable for use in the most important ceremonies, for bathing ritual objects, for mixing with the blood of sacrifices to create a sacred liquid that combined earth and water, life and death. The concept of teotl, divine water or sacred water, was central to Aztec religious practice. Teotl was water that had been specially blessed, water used in ceremonies, water that carried spiritual power. Springs where teotl could be found naturally were especially sacred sites, places of pilgrimage, locations where the boundary between mortal and divine realms was thin and permeable. One such sacred spring was located at the base of Mount Tlaloc, the mountain named for Chalchiuhtlicue's companion, where the rain god's temple stood. Pilgrims would climb the mountain, bringing offerings, seeking blessings, hoping to receive visions or messages from the water deities. At the sacred spring, they would fill vessels with teotl to bring back to their homes and communities, carrying Chalchiuhtlicue's blessing in physical form. Another important sacred water site was located in the center of Tenochtitlan itself, a spring that provided the city with fresh water even though it rose up in the middle of the salty Lake Texcoco. This spring was considered a direct manifestation of Chalchiuhtlicue's power and generosity, proof that the goddess favored the city and its people. A shrine was built over this spring, and the water that flowed from it was used for the most important ceremonies, the most sacred rituals, the most crucial spiritual work. The relationship between the Aztec people and Chalchiuhtlicue was not one-sided or purely utilitarian. Yes, the people needed water and needed the goddess to provide it. But the relationship was deeper than simple transaction. It was more like kinship, like family bonds, based on mutual care and mutual obligation. The people honored Chalchiuhtlicue not just because they feared what would happen if they didn't, but because they genuinely loved her, genuinely felt gratitude for her gifts, genuinely wanted to maintain right relationship with her. This attitude toward Chalchiuhtlicue reflected a broader Aztec worldview in which humans and gods were interconnected, interdependent, participating together in maintaining cosmic balance. The gods needed human worship and offerings just as humans needed divine blessings and protection. Neither could exist without the other. The universe was a collaborative project, and everyone, mortal and divine alike, had responsibilities to fulfill. For Chalchiuhtlicue, this meant providing water, protecting children and mothers, blessing the land with fertility, maintaining the rivers and lakes and springs that sustained all life. For humans, it meant making appropriate offerings, performing prescribed ceremonies, using water wisely and gratefully, teaching children to honor the goddess, and living in ways that acknowledged her importance and power. This reciprocal relationship was expressed in the Nahuatl concept of Tlazotlalistli, the debt of love and gratitude that existed between humans and gods. Humans owed the gods gratitude for the gift of life and all that sustained life. But the debt was not onerous or burdensome. It was more like the debt a child owes to a loving parent, a debt that is gladly acknowledged, that inspires devotion rather than resentment, that makes one want to give back not out of obligation but out of genuine affection and appreciation. When the people made offerings to Chalchiuhtlicue, they did so with this spirit of Tlazotlalistli. They gave jade beads not because they had to but because jade was precious and they wanted to give the goddess something precious. They gave turquoise stones because the blue-green color reminded them of water and of her jade skirt, and giving these stones was a way of reflecting her own beauty back to her. They gave flowers because flowers were beautiful and brought joy, and they wanted Chalchiuhtlicue to experience joy as they experienced joy when rain fell or when a spring bubbled up or when a newborn was safely delivered. The songs sung in Chalchiuhtlicue's honor were not formulaic recitations but genuine expressions of devotion. One such song, preserved in Spanish records made after the conquest, went something like this. O Chalchiuhtlicue, you of the Jade Skirt, you whose eyes are as deep as lake waters, you who bring forth the springs from stone, you who guide the rivers on their long journeys to the sea, you who protect the child emerging from the womb, you who cleanse and purify and refresh, we sing to you with grateful hearts. We thank you for the water that flows, for the rain that falls, for the mist that rises, for every drop that sustains our lives. You are mother to us, sister, protector, friend. Your love flows over us like gentle streams. Your power moves through us like mighty rivers. Your presence surrounds us like the great lake that holds our city. Blessed are we to live within your domain. Blessed are we to drink your sweet waters. Blessed are we to receive your care. O Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of waters, we honor you, we thank you, we love you. These songs were taught to children who would sing them throughout their lives, passing them on to their own children in turn. The songs kept Chalchiuhtlicue present in memory and heart, ensured that she was not forgotten, maintained the connection between goddess and people across generations. Stories about Chalchiuhtlicue were also carefully preserved and retold. The story of the fourth son was particularly important, told and retold around evening fires, painted in codices, carved into temple walls. It was a story with multiple layers of meaning, teaching different lessons depending on how it was understood. On one level, it was a creation myth, explaining how the current world came to be through the ending of the previous world. It explained why fish existed, why there were so many different kinds of water creatures, why humans felt an affinity with the water even though they lived on land. It provided cosmic context, placing human existence within a larger framework of divine drama and cosmic cycles. On another level, it was a moral tale about the dangers of doubt and the importance of trusting oneself. Chalchiuhtlicue had been tricked by Tezcatlipoca into doubting her own goodness, and that doubt had led to catastrophe. The lesson was clear. Know yourself, trust your own heart, don't let others' accusations make you question what you know to be true. At the same time, the story acknowledged that doubt is powerful, that even gods can be vulnerable to it, that certainty can be shaken even when it shouldn't be. On yet another level, it was a story about the nature of water itself and the nature of Chalchiuhtlicue as water's divine embodiment. Water responds to conditions, changes form, flows where it can flow, adapts to circumstances. When Chalchiuhtlicue was in a state of grief, the water she embodied reflected that grief, flooding the world. But water also preserves life. The people became fish rather than dying. Water is both destroyer and preserver, ender and transformer. The story captured this duality perfectly, showing how the same flood that ended one world made possible the beginning of another. For storytellers in the Aztec world, the tale of Chalchiuhtlicue and the fourth son was rich material that could be adapted to different audiences and different purposes. When telling the story to children, the emphasis might be on the magical elements, people turning into fish, a bridge to paradise, tears that lasted for 52 years. When telling it to young adults being initiated into religious mysteries, the emphasis might be on the theological implications, the nature of transformation, the relationship between endings and beginnings, the role of divine will in shaping the cosmos. When telling it to experienced priests and scholars, the emphasis might be on the deeper philosophical questions, the problem of doubt, the nature of truth, the relationship between perception and reality. The story also had practical implications for how people understood and related to water. If Chalchiuhtlicue's tears could flood the world, then clearly water was powerful beyond human control. This understanding encouraged respect for water's power, encouraged caution when dealing with rivers and lakes, encouraged humility in the face of natural forces. At the same time, If Chalchiuhtlicue had transformed people into fish rather than let them die, then clearly the goddess was compassionate and protective, which encouraged trust and devotion. The dual nature of water as both life-giving and life-taking was recognized in Aztec funeral practices for those who died water-related deaths. Drowning, death from waterborne illness, death from lightning, which was associated with rain gods. All of these led to burial in a special section of Tlalocan, Chalchiuhtlicue's paradise. These dead were not cremated like most Aztec dead but were buried with jade beads placed in their mouths, symbolizing the water that had taken them and the goddess who would receive them. The funeral ceremony for a drowned person included special prayers to Chalchiuhtlicue, acknowledging that the deceased had died in her domain and asking her to welcome them gently, to recognize that they had not chosen this death but had been called to her realm unexpectedly. The family would make generous offerings to the goddess, not out of anger or resentment but out of a desire to ensure that their loved one would be well treated in the afterlife, would find peace and comfort in Tlalocan's eternal springtime. Those who died in childbirth were also sometimes associated with Chalchiuhtlicue, especially if water had been involved in some way in the circumstances of death. These women were honored as warriors who had died in battle, the battle of bringing forth new life, and were believed to accompany the sun on its journey across the sky. But their bodies were often buried near water sources, ensuring they remained within Chalchiuhtlicue's care, under the protection of the goddess who had tried to protect them during their fatal labor. The importance of Chalchiuhtlicue extended beyond the religious sphere into the political and social organization of Aztec society. Control of water resources was a major source of political power. The ruler of Tenochtitlan maintained authority partly through his control of the city's water supply, the aqueducts and springs and distribution systems that provided water to different neighborhoods. This control was understood to be delegated from Chalchiuhtlicue. The ruler didn't own the water, he merely managed it on behalf of the goddess and the people. Disputes over water were taken very seriously and were often resolved through religious ritual as much as through legal proceedings. If two farmers argued over irrigation rights, they might take their dispute to a priest of Chalchiuhtlicue, who would perform divination using water to determine what the goddess's will was. The priest would place a bowl of pure water before an image of Chalchiuhtlicue, would state the nature of the dispute, and would watch how the water behaved, whether it rippled or stayed still, whether it seemed to flow toward one side or the other, whether reflections appeared in it that might give clues to the proper resolution. This practice of hydromancy divination using water was common and respected. Water was believed to carry messages from Chalchiuhtlicue, to reveal truths that were hidden, to provide guidance when guidance was needed. Healers used hydromancy to diagnose illnesses. Priests used it to interpret omens and predict future events. Parents used it to help choose names for newborn children, watching how water rippled when different names were spoken aloud, looking for signs that Chalchiuhtlicue approved of a particular name. The power of water to cleanse and purify was also central to many Aztec rituals. Before important ceremonies, participants would bathe in water that had been blessed by priests of Chalchiuhtlicue, washing away any spiritual impurity that might interfere with the ritual's effectiveness. Warriors about to go into battle would bathe ritually, asking Chalchiuhtlicue to cleanse them of fear and doubt, to make them pure and strong for the coming fight. The ritual steam baths called temazcalli were also associated with Chalchiuhtlicue. These small, enclosed structures were heated with fire, and water was poured over hot stones to create steam. Sitting in the temazcalli was believed to cleanse both body and spirit, to cure illnesses, to ease childbirth, to provide healing of many kinds. The steam itself was a combination of water and fire, bringing together Chalchiuhtlicue's domain with the domain of fire gods, creating a space where physical and spiritual healing could occur. Women especially used the temazcalli, particularly around the time of childbirth. A woman in labor might be taken to the temazcalli, where the heat and steam would help ease her pain and perhaps speed the delivery. After birth, both mother and baby would be bathed in the temazcalli, the steam helping to cleanse them, the heat helping to restore strength. Throughout this process, prayers would be offered to Chalchiuhtlicue, asking her to protect mother and child, to ensure healthy recovery, to bless the new life that had entered the world. The practical importance of these water-centered practices cannot be overstated. In a world without modern medicine, where infection and illness were constant threats, the emphasis on water's cleansing properties actually provided real health benefits. Bathing regularly, washing wounds with clean water, using steam to ease respiratory problems, all of these practices, undertaken for religious reasons, also had genuine medical value. The Aztec understanding that certain water sources were purer than others also had practical benefit. They learned to distinguish between water that was safe to drink and water that might cause illness. They understood that water flowing from springs was generally cleaner than water from stagnant pools. They developed filtering techniques, passing water through sand or woven cloth to remove impurities. All of this practical knowledge was intertwined with religious understanding. The purest water was the water most blessed by Chalchiuhtlicue, and water blessed by the goddess was safe to drink. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Spanish forces in 1521 disrupted but did not entirely destroy the worship of Chalchiuhtlicue. The Spanish were shocked and disturbed by many aspects of Aztec religion, particularly the practice of human sacrifice, and they worked actively to suppress indigenous religious practices and convert the population to Christianity. Many temples were destroyed, including temples dedicated to Chalchiuhtlicue. Idols were smashed, codices were burned, priests were killed or forced to abandon their religious roles. The elaborate ceremonies that had honored the water goddess were forbidden. The public worship that had been such an important part of Aztec life was driven underground or eliminated entirely. But Chalchiuhtlicue did not disappear. She transformed, adapted, found new ways to persist even under oppression. In some cases, she was syncretized with Christian figures, particularly with the Virgin Mary. Just as Chalchiuhtlicue had been a maternal figure, protector of mothers and children, so too was Mary. The two divine women became blended in the minds and hearts of the people, who would pray to Mary using language and concepts that came from their worship of Chalchiuhtlicue. Sacred springs that had been dedicated to Chalchiuhtlicue were Christianized, with shrines to Mary or other saints built nearby, but the people who came to these springs still understood them as places where the old goddess's power flowed. They would make offerings and speak prayers that combined Christian and indigenous elements, maintaining connection to their ancestral traditions even while appearing to conform to the new religion imposed upon them. In more remote areas, away from Spanish control, worship of Chalchiuhtlicue continued more openly for longer periods. Communities that had less contact with colonial authorities maintained their traditional practices, teaching their children the old stories, performing the old ceremonies, making offerings to the goddess as they always had. When Spanish priests or officials came to these areas, the people would hide their religious objects, would claim to have converted to Christianity, would attend Catholic Mass while still maintaining their devotion to their ancestral gods. Over time, as generations passed and Spanish control became more complete, much of the explicit worship of Chalchiuhtlicue faded. The great temples were never rebuilt. The elaborate ceremonies were never fully restored. The priesthood that had maintained her worship was destroyed and never reconstituted in its original form. But Chalchiuhtlicue survived in other ways, in folk practices and traditional beliefs that persisted long after the formal religion had been suppressed. The custom of washing newborn babies while speaking words of blessing continued, though the prayers might now be addressed to Mary or a Catholic saint rather than to Chalchiuhtlicue by name. The understanding that certain springs were sacred, that their water had special healing properties, continued. The deep respect for water, the belief that it should never be wasted or contaminated, the understanding that water was precious and should be treated with reverence, all of these attitudes that had been shaped by worship of Chalchiuhtlicue persisted. In modern Mexico, there is a renewed interest in indigenous traditions, including the worship of deities like Chalchiuhtlicue. Some people actively work to revive and preserve these traditions, teaching the old stories, practicing the old ceremonies, trying to maintain connection with ancestral wisdom and ancestral ways of relating to the natural world. Contemporary environmental movements have found inspiration in the Aztec understanding of water as sacred. The idea that water is not just a resource to be exploited but a divine gift to be honored resonates with modern concerns about water pollution, water scarcity, and the need for sustainable water management. Chalchiuhtlicue, the goddess who embodied water and who demanded that water be treated with respect, becomes a symbol for a more reverential, more sustainable relationship with natural resources. Artists continue to depict Chalchiuhtlicue, creating paintings and sculptures that draw on traditional iconography while bringing contemporary sensibilities to the representation of the goddess. Writers incorporate her into their work, using her story to explore themes of grief and transformation, doubt and certainty, the relationship between humans and nature, the power of water in both physical and metaphorical senses. The story of Chalchiuhtlicue's tears flooding the fourth sun has been interpreted in various ways by modern readers. Some see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting emotion overwhelm reason. Others see it as a poignant meditation on how easily self-doubt can be weaponized against even the most loving and devoted individuals. Still others focus on the transformative aspect, how the people became fish, how ending gave way to beginning, how destruction and creation are intertwined. Environmental readings of the story emphasize water's dual nature as life-giver and life-taker, highlighting the need for humans to respect natural forces rather than assuming they can be controlled. Feminist readings explore Chalchiuhtlicue's experience of being gaslit by Tezcatlipoca, her doubt and grief, and ultimately her vindication and continued power despite the trauma she experienced. The goddess's association with childbirth and the protection of mothers and newborns remains particularly resonant. In a world where maternal mortality remains a concern, where access to safe childbirth care is still not universal, Chalchiuhtlicue can be seen as a symbol of the need for better support for mothers, for recognition of the danger and courage involved in bringing new life into the world, for the importance of protecting the most vulnerable moments of life. The practice of water baptism, which exists in Christianity and which was also present in Aztec religious practice under Chalchiuhtlicue's patronage, creates an interesting point of cultural overlap and continuity. The idea that water can cleanse spiritually as well as physically, that immersion in or sprinkling with water can mark important transitions or confer blessings, appears in many religious traditions around the world. Chalchiuhtlicue's role in Aztec water baptism of newborns was one expression of this widespread human intuition about water's sacred and purifying properties. The jade skirt that gives Chalchiuhtlicue her name continues to capture imagination. Jade was the most precious stone to the Aztecs, valued far above gold, associated with life and fertility and growth. A skirt made of jade or the color of jade or flowing like jade-colored water represents the ultimate in preciousness, in value, and importance. The image of Chalchiuhtlicue wearing her jade skirt, with water flowing from it to form rivers and streams, is a powerful one that speaks to water's essential role in sustaining all life. In some contemporary spiritual practices that draw on Aztec tradition, people invoke Chalchiuhtlicue when working with water for healing or purification. They might pray to her before bathing, asking that the water cleanse not just their bodies but also their spirits. They might invoke her name when drinking water, acknowledging the gift and expressing gratitude. They might speak to her when standing beside rivers or lakes, developing personal relationship with the goddess through regular practice and devotion. Some practitioners create home altars honoring Chalchiuhtlicue, placing on these altars images of the goddess along with items associated with water, jade or turquoise stones, seashells, bowls of water, blue and green fabrics or papers. They might make regular offerings of flowers or incense, might speak prayers or sing songs in her honor, might simply sit quietly before the altar and feel connection with the ancient goddess and all she represents. These modern practices, whether they are authentic revivals of ancient tradition or contemporary innovations inspired by ancient traditions, demonstrate the enduring power of Chalchiuhtlicue as a symbol and as a divine presence. She speaks to something fundamental in human experience: our relationship with water, our dependence on water, our recognition that water is both ordinary and miraculous, both commonplace and sacred. Every time we turn on a tap and water flows out, every time we drink a glass of water and feel our thirst quenched, every time we stand beside a stream or lake and feel peace wash over us, every time we bathe and feel refreshed, every time we watch rain fall and feel gratitude for it, in all of these moments, whether we name her or not, whether we believe in her or not, we are touching the domain that was once understood to be Chalchiuhtlicue's, experiencing the gift that was once understood to flow from her divine generosity. The story of Chalchiuhtlicue reminds us to honor water, to be grateful for it, to recognize it as precious rather than taking it for granted. In an age when water scarcity is becoming a global crisis, when rivers are being drained and aquifers depleted, when climate change threatens to disrupt the water cycles that civilization depends upon, the ancient wisdom embodied in Chalchiuhtlicue's worship becomes newly relevant. The goddess teaches us to see water as sacred, to treat it with respect, to use it wisely and gratefully rather than wastefully. She teaches us to recognize the interconnections between water and life, between water and fertility, between water and transformation. She teaches us that what sustains us deserves our reverence, that what we depend upon should be honored rather than merely exploited. And perhaps most importantly, Chalchiuhtlicue's story teaches us about resilience and transformation. Despite being deceived and manipulated, despite weeping for 52 years, despite ending an entire world age in her grief, the goddess persisted. She continued to provide water, continued to protect mothers and children, continued to fulfill her essential role in maintaining life. She was wounded but not destroyed, hurt but not defeated, changed but not diminished. In this way, Chalchiuhtlicue becomes a model not just for how to relate to water or to nature but for how to survive pain and continue being present, continue caring, continue serving even after experiencing profound hurt. Her story acknowledges that grief and doubt are powerful, that they can cause catastrophic harm, but it also affirms that they do not have to be the end of the story, that recovery and renewal are possible, that life continues even after devastating transformation. The people who were transformed into fish during the flood of the fourth sun lost their human form, lost their familiar world, lost everything they had known, but they continued to exist, adapted to new circumstances, found ways to live in a changed environment. Some eventually transformed again, emerging onto land to begin the fifth sun. Others remained in the water, becoming ancestors of all water-dwelling creatures. In either case they persisted. They survived. They adapted. They transformed loss into new possibilities. This theme of transformation through water, of endings that become beginnings, of old forms giving way to new forms while something essential persists. This theme resonates deeply with human experience. We all undergo transformations throughout our lives. Childhood gives way to adulthood. Young adulthood gives way to middle age and eventually to old age. Relationships begin and end. Careers start and finish. People we love die. Places we knew change beyond recognition. Nothing stays the same. Everything flows like water. But like water, we persist even as we flow and change. Like the people of the fourth sun, we can survive transformations that seem devastating, can adapt to new circumstances, can find ways to continue even when the world we knew has ended. The core of who we are, like the essential wetness of water, remains even as our external form changes. Chalchiuhtlicue, through her tears and her transformation of humanity, through her grief and her continuing care, embodies this paradox of change and continuity, of transformation and persistence. She is the goddess of water, and water teaches these lessons every day to anyone willing to observe and learn. So as we move through our lives, as we face our own floods and droughts, our own periods of abundance and scarcity, our own transformations and adaptations, we can think of Chalchiuhtlicue and draw wisdom and comfort from her story. We can remember that water, while it flows and changes, also persists and nourishes. We can remember that endings make room for beginnings. We can remember that what seems like destruction may actually be transformation. We can remember that care and love, even when tested by doubt and grief, can endure and continue to bless. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey with Chalchiuhtlicue, she of the Jade Skirt, goddess of rivers and lakes, protector of mothers and children, guardian of all waters upon the earth. We have followed her story from her creation by the greatest gods, through her reign as the sun of the fourth age, through her grief and tears and the flooding of the world, to her continuing role in the fifth sun and her enduring presence even into modern times. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself floating gently on calm water, supported and held, safe and at peace. Perhaps you can hear the soft sound of a distant stream, flowing eternally, patient and persistent, following its course from mountains to sea. Perhaps you can feel the refreshment of cool, clean water, quenching thirst, washing away weariness, renewing body and spirit. Know that water continues to flow, continues to sustain life, continues to transform and renew. Know that the wisdom embodied in Chalchiuhtlicue's story, respect for water, gratitude for its gifts, recognition of its power, understanding of its essential role in life, remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago when her temple stood tall and her worship filled the air with songs of praise. I hope this story has given you peace, has carried you gently toward the shores of sleep on a current of flowing narrative, has helped you find the calm that water at its gentlest can bring. May your dreams be like clear springs, pure and refreshing. May your rest be like the deep stillness of a mountain lake, profound and restorative. Join me again for more journeys into ancient wisdom, more stories of gods and goddesses who shaped how entire civilizations understood the world, more explorations of myth and meaning. Until then, sleep well, rest deeply, and may you always have pure water to drink, gentle rain to nourish your life, and the blessing of transformation when change must come. Good night, and may Chalchiuhtlicue's care flow over you like a gentle stream.